Hello, and welcome to our webinar on renewable energy. Today's topic was inspired by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of clean energy for all. My name is Veronica Coyle, and I'm from Data for Good. At Data for Good, our mission is to enable and inspire people to be able to use their data and data skills for the benefit of humanity. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, just a quick word on the format for today before I introduce the first of our incredible speakers. As we're using the webinar format of Zoom, your mics are off, but we definitely want to hear your questions and comments. So if you move your mouse to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A button. So please enter questions as we go, and don't forget to include who the question is directed to, as we'll have the question and answer session at the end after we hear from both our speakers. So let me introduce our first speaker. Gero Farruggio is the head of Australia and Global Renewables at Rystad Energy. He is also the co-founder of Sustainable Energy Research Analytics, a Rystad Energy company based here in Sydney. He has over 20 years experience working in the energy industry and working as an advisor in the industry and working with renewable energy data. Gero, thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Thanks, Veronica. I'll just share my screen here. So hopefully you can see that okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Great. Right, well, good morning, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be here today supporting the great work that Samantha and the team and Veronica and the team are doing here at Data for Good. So I'm absolutely honored to also present alongside Professor Ken Baldwin and look forward to his insights in the second half of this session. So this webinar, as Veronica said, was inspired by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of affordable and reliable and sustainable energy for all. And I think this is goal number 7. I've just put a slide on here of 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. So over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll take a deep dive into the global utility renewable sector, and in particular highlighting a few things, key trends, a look at what is driving activity, and finally an introduction to green hydrogen. Now the image here is a satellite image of the Bluegrass solar farm. It's about a 170 megawatt solar farm in the Western Downs region of Queensland. And this is an example of how we use this technology and this data to track the construction progress over time for some of these assets. During this presentation, I'll present you a few charts and graphs, and these will all be built up from our bottom-up coverage of over 90,000 solar, wind, and storage assets across 180 countries. Now, the size of the bubbles here represents the project capacity, and we have colored them by the energy type and the energy technology. Despite having the least number of assets, about 1,200, offshore wind is actually quite prominent here. And that's due to the scale of these offshore wind projects compared to traditional forms of renewable energy like solar and onshore wind. And we'll touch on scale later in the presentation. But in terms of operating renewable generation, like over half is onshore wind, about a third is solar PV, large-scale solar PV, and about 3% is offshore wind, with the remainder being energy storage. So the first chart looks at capacity installed by year and by this energy category or the technology. And there are a couple of clear takeaways here. We'll look back for many years to come on 2010 to 20 to be a pivotal year in utility renewables and the energy transition. And there was a clear shift in acceleration that you can see in this chart. Now, historically, onshore wind has been the dominant technology. Large-scale solar PV is relatively new, but really growing at a much faster rate than onshore wind. Offshore wind is also growing at pace, but from a much smaller base. And we expect about double the level of capacity this year than we had in 2020 from offshore wind. Finally, we're entering the era of utility storage, large-scale batteries and pumped hydro. Yet all the headlines and everyone seems to talk about today is hydrogen. And we'll go into why this is. So again, the same chart, but instead of splitting by technology, we'll split it by continent. And you can see where the trends are by region in terms of capacity installed. Globally, we estimate about 175 gigawatts will be energized this year. How does Australia compare? Well, it's about 3% of the global utility renewables commission. Now, I excluded residential and corporate and industrial C&I solar here. So it's just utility scale, it's about 3%, and that's up from 2% last year. Now you can see from the insert that large-scale renewables, in particular here in Australia, is a very recent thing. In the past, it's been dominated by onshore wind, and really large-scale solar PV only kicked off here in Australia a few years ago in 2018. And this is largely due to the great work by the team at ARENA and their large-scale solar funding. Now, batteries, as you can see, are really ramping up in Australia, and that's certainly an area to watch and an area of interest here locally. And my final chart, a final look at the same chart, instead of splitting by the continent, we're splitting it by the size of the projects. So assets about 50 megawatts or less dominated capacity installed only a few years ago. Over half the capacity installed in 2015 were from assets that were 50 megawatts or less. Now, next year, the assets of 50 megawatts or less will account for less than 18% of global capacity installed, so much less than what we've seen traditionally over time. In comparison, we'll see 6 times more capacity from projects over 300 megawatts or above. So projects of this scale is a very recent development in utility renewables. And you can see here from this chart, it's a key driver in the growth outlook. Now, it's not just the project size that is scaling up. The technology is also. And here, GE and Vestas are introducing absolutely enormous offshore wind turbines. And if you place one of them in Sydney Harbour, like we have in this illustration here, it stands over 260 meters tall. And it's taller than the Sydney Tower, and it's on par with the new Crown Casino building. Now, this technology is also influencing onshore turbines also, and they're getting bigger and bigger as well. Well, it doesn't make for quite as nice image, but solar panel technology is developing also. And with panels today or tomorrow bearing very little resemblance to those that were installed in recent years. They're much lower cost going forward and a much higher output. But today's projects are also nothing compared to what is being planned. Mega grids and real gigascale projects are on the horizon. And one of the biggest ones globally is being proposed right here in Australia. Suncable is planning a 14 gigawatt solar farm with a 3,800 kilometer cable to Singapore. Now, the project is still a few years away, and it requires a solar array around about 12 kilometers by 12 kilometers. And it could take about 4 years to build this if it goes ahead. Now, we've added a couple of other illustrations here for you. And what if this project powers Australia or even the world? How big would these projects be? Well, Australia would require a slightly bigger solar farm at about 45 kilometers by 45 kilometers. And assuming there is interconnectivity throughout the whole world, this will require a solar farm to power global energy demand of about 500 by 500 kilometers. Now, that's a pretty big solar farm. But again, it is power in the world. One thing this does illustrate is that land coverage is not really an issue. We could technically even power the world from the Northern Territory and not even touch a house in the process. So let's move on and look at some of the drivers for the activity. Now, the energy transition is really gaining momentum. And this is as governments are pursuing emissions reduction goals and a green recovery to the global pandemic. Now, Australians will be forgiven for not noticing or realizing that global targets continue to be set and revised for renewable capacity and also net zero emissions. And here we mark up some of the key countries. Obviously, a lot of movement in the US with the new administration, but some high percentages in Europe with the UK setting 87% and a 40 gigawatt target for offshore wind, solar in Germany at 100 gigawatts. So you're really seeing quite a lot of offshore wind targets. And here in Asia, global targets are for renewables in China and Japan of the 38 to 40%. So the insert looks at Rystad's energy transition scenario to achieve the 1.5 degrees. And one thing it highlights is the real importance of utility solar and wind. So what I've done is split all the technologies down and compared them to the respective technologies to the outlook and broken down by the operating assets and those proposed. So the gray area is the yet to find generation to meet the demand for each of these technologies. In other words, we're really just at the start of this journey. Despite there being a lot of investment and a lot of growth in recent years, we're very much at the start of this journey, and there's plenty more work to do over the next couple of decades. So previously we looked at country targets, and this chart looks at corporate targets, and it looked in particular at the top developers. Now I've excluded China because if we include China, that just dominates the top developers globally. But we can see here the oil and gas companies are transitioning and aiming to be major renewable developers globally with new stretch targets. And the traditional major renewable developers, they continue to revise their targets, setting absolutely incredible goals there. And this includes traditional technologies like solar and wind, but also emerging ones as well, like the offshore wind and hydrogen. So let's introduce hydrogen here. And some of you will be familiar on the call with hydrogen, others not. So I've introduced a little cheat sheet here to give you a quick overview of hydrogen and why it's so important. Firstly, there's a few different types of hydrogen, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're focusing on green hydrogen. And that's the one of most interest because it's made using renewable energy. How is it used? Well, essentially, it's for purposes that you can't simply be electrified. And why the fuss? Well, it's in abundance. It's clean. You can use it with no emissions. It can be stored and transported very similar to how gas can. And therefore, it's seen as a real key element to this decarbonization. So at Rystad, we're tracking over 200 or almost 200 gigawatts of green hydrogen electrolyzers. This is the insert here. You can see that Australia accounts for the majority of those projects. And the map shows the electrolyzer projects that are planned in the near and medium term. Now, the largest electrolyzer today is about 20 megawatts. And we expect a couple of hundred megawatts to be commissioned in the next year or so. But as you can see, there's a real step change with projects like the one that Fortescue's proposing in Bell Bay, which itself is over 200 megawatts being planned. These are coming in the next couple of years, and it will be a transformation in what has traditionally been in terms of green hydrogen electrolyzers. So overall, we're tracking this 200 gigawatts of projects, and this is what we refer to as hydrogen wars, as different countries are racing to incentivize the development of green hydrogen, both for their domestic purposes, but also for this emerging seaborne market. Now, hydrogen is still in its infancy and is still being developed. And one of the key challenges is the commercialization of it. So we estimate that you need to subsidize green hydrogen by about 75% to make it commercial today. And how do we achieve that? We do that by three ways. There's three pillars to achieving this cheap hydrogen, which we present in these charts. The first is low-cost electrolyzers. And the chart there shows the recent announced electrolyzer cost. And you can see that scale is really important here. So that's why you've seen a lot of really big green hydrogen electrolyzers being proposed. It's because that helps kind of drive down the cost of the electrolyzers. So this is certainly heading in the right direction. Low-cost power, where we've seen an abundance of that too, in particular in the Middle East and in the US, where they're really setting new goals in terms of low-cost PPAs, even close to the $10 per megawatt hours. And finally, high utilization. You can't power a green hydrogen electrolyzer certainly by solar alone, because that would only work for a few hours a day. So we want that utilization. You want to be used 24 hours a day to get the maximum output for it. So you need to combine that with wind and solar, get the highest utilization, and potentially firm that with something like hydro capacity. And that's why Tasmania is so well positioned to see the first green hydrogen electrolyzers in Australia because of that firming from hydro. So my final slide just looks closely at Australia. As you can see from that original map that we had, there's quite a lot of bubbles in Australia. We have about 250 gigawatts of potential capacity from over 1,100 projects. And that's absolutely huge. And it grows at about 50 or 60 gigawatts per year. And you see that from the top chart in the top left. It shows no sign of slowing down. It's certainly on target to add another 50 or 60 gigawatts to our pipeline of renewable projects this year. And the bottom left chart shows the breakdown in terms of the concepts, those that have just been proposed versus the ones with approval, versus the ones about 7 gigawatts that's currently under construction, and about 15 gigawatts that are currently operating today. So with that, I'll introduce Ken, who will go in more detail into Australia and how well it's positioned, not just to deliver its own renewable energy, but also this emerging seaborne green hydrogen market.
Gero, thank you for that. That was really a fascinating insight to global position on renewable energy, and particularly some of those growing gaps in terms of what the demand is and what the projected supply is given the plans. Just want to remind everyone that you do have the opportunity to enter questions. So use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And please type in which speaker you're directing your question at, because we'll get to questions at the end of the presentation. So again, thank you very much, Gero, and we'll be talking to you again during the Q&A.
Pleasure.
It's now my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Ken Baldwin. Now, Ken is the director of the Australian National University's Grand Challenge, Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific. His work focuses on helping to drive the energy transition, particularly for Australia's future export industries based on renewable energy. He has received many awards, including the Australian Government Eureka Prize for promoting understanding of science for his role in initiating and championing Science Meets Parliament. So Ken, it's an honor to have you speaking today, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you indeed for the opportunity to speak with everyone here today, and my appreciation to Data for Good for providing that opportunity. So I'd like to continue on from Gero's talk and put this more in the Australian context, and to look at perhaps an optimistic future for Australia as a participant in this massive global energy transformation that the world is going through. So hopefully you can all see my screen. And I'd like to just connect with Gero's talk by looking historically at where the world's energy use has come from since the Industrial Revolution. And there's a key reason why I want to target the Industrial Revolution. So we're starting back here in 1850, and what you can see is that from a world that relied pretty much purely on biomass, we've developed into a world that relies on fossil fuels, so coal, oil, gas, and we're now about to undergo a transformation that is akin to the Industrial Revolution. Now, obviously, since the early days of the Industrial Revolution, we've added hydropower, we've added nuclear power, and if you've got really good eyes, you can see there's this tiny little purple line at the top here that's called other renewables. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that this will soon replace everything that you see here in the way of fossil fuels in the coming decades, and that this will happen at an enormous pace, and it will be akin to the Industrial Revolution. And I might make a quick comment. The Industrial Revolution actually happened in a very chaotic and uncoordinated way. It resulted in dislocation, social upheaval, a whole range of geopolitical shifts, and in some sense was unplanned and effectively uncoordinated. We have a great opportunity, knowing what is coming, to make sure that this massive transformation in our economies worldwide and in our energy systems is done in a coordinated, efficient and timely fashion. And this graph hopefully just shows you the enormity of this change that is about to come upon us. So just again, connecting with some of the material that Gero had, here is what's happened in more recent times in the way of installations for solar PV from the years 2015 to 2018, for wind, for gas, for coal, for hydro, nuclear, bio, and solar thermal and geothermal. And what we're seeing here is a shift away from coal, so fewer coal installations. We're seeing an increase in PV dramatically, fairly steady installation rate for wind. And then if we look in the last year, what we're seeing now is the dominance of solar and wind over all other forms of new energy installation. And this is only continuing that transition that we talked about before. And indeed, Australia plays a central role in this. So if we look at the annual installation of solar and wind per capita, then what we see is that Australia is leading the world, not just by a little bit, but by a country mile, as they say. So we are installing solar and wind per capita at 10 times the rate of the rest of the world and 3 to 4 times the rate of our major competitors. And at a rate of more than 250 watts per capita, this is only increasing, as we can see in the next graph. So this shows the installation of solar and wind from 2016 up till 2020. And I don't show any data before that because there was very little data to show before that. And this was largely because of the uncertainty arising from government policy shifts backwards and forwards during this period of climate wars, which still continues, I might add. So we're in a period of enormous policy uncertainty. But out of that chaos has risen this enormous growth in renewables. And this is purely driven by the economics. It's purely driven by the learning rate of the technology. And it is happening in spite of, but not because of policy largely, although there was some policy drivers early on with things like the renewable energy target. But now that this has been reached, this continued trend of investment is still going gangbusters. And what we're seeing is that Australia is currently installing large-scale renewables at around 4 gigawatts per annum. And it's installing rooftop solar at around 3 gigawatts per annum, giving a total of around 7 gigawatts per annum. So just to put that into perspective, a major thermal power station, whether that be coal-fired, gas-fired, nuclear, whatever, is of order a gigawatt. So this is the equivalent of installing 7 major thermal power stations a year in capacity terms. If we think about it in energy terms, though, we know that the capacity factor of renewables is much less than 100%. Typically for solar, it's of order 20-25%. Wind, it's 40 or more than 40%. Let's take an average of 30% for the sake of argument. Then this is equivalent to, let's say, 2 gigawatts of energy, of capacity installed per annum running continuously, which is of order 2 major thermal power stations. So this is a rapid change. And if we plot a simple linear extension of this and we assume that demand is going to remain constant, and in fact, demand has actually been falling over the last decade or so, but let's just assume it's constant, then what we see is that renewables will exceed fossil fuel in a few years' time, and then will reach close to 100% in the early 2030s. However, what this does not take into account is potential increases in demand as we move to adopt all the other greenhouse gas emissions in the Australian economy. And this shows a pie chart of where they lie. A third of it comes from electricity generation, 19% stationary energy, which, for example, is space heating, 19% in transport, 11% in fugitive emissions from mining fossil fuels and the like, 6% from industrial processes, and then the more difficult areas to deal with agriculture, waste, etc. However, the low-hanging fruit here is the renewable energy transformation in the electricity sector that we just talked about. So if we can achieve that in the coming decade, then this is going to, drive the bulk of our greenhouse gas emissions targets under the Paris Agreement, but also it's going to drive the removal of emissions from the other sectors of the economy as we progressively electrify all those other sectors. So we'd include, for example, heat pumps instead of gas heating. We'd include electric vehicles instead of internal combustion engines. We'd eventually not be using fossil fuels, so the fugitive emissions would go away, and industrial processes could then be powered by a combination of renewable electricity, hydrogen, and other factors. Agriculture, land waste, etc., are going to be more difficult to address, but what you can see here is that 80% or so of the emissions could be addressed simply by electrifying everything and by using renewable electricity in that process. So then what we have is an increase in demand. Obviously, as we electrify everything, demand will go up. Here's one scenario we could imagine where we basically double the total demand as a result of this process. And what this means, of course, is that we'll need even more renewables to power this and to eventually be carbon neutral by the mid-century. And so this pushes out the crossover between fossil fuels and renewables to maybe the middle part of this decade, but only by a few years at most. So this just shows you the scope of the transformation that is out there and happening at the moment. And indeed, Australia's place in the world as a major energy powerhouse is also going to play a role in this. If we look at where the future demand for energy is going to come from, 2/3 of this demand growth, according to the International Energy Agency, is going to come from the Asia-Pacific region. And what we will expect is that because Australia is a major energy supplier into the region, that we will have a significant role to play in this. So this is just a map which has superimposed on it our imports and our exports of energy. And this is numbers in petajoules, so these are energy units. They're not dollars or tons, they're units of energy. So you can see that we import, various forms of refined petroleum products, but we also export huge amounts of energy in the form of coal, large amounts of energy in the form of natural gas, as this has increased by more than 50% in recent times. And interestingly, we export about 1/3 of the amount of energy in uranium as we do in coal. So we're a huge energy exporter. And as we know, this is all going to change in the coming decades as demand for fossil fuels in the form of coal and natural gas dry up. And this transformation, of course, is going to happen in our major trading partners, and this means really in the Asia-Pacific region. So can we meet this new demand with renewables? Well, Gero's shown you a very similar graph. This shows the solar resource that Australia has, and you don't need to know what the numbers actually mean. All you need to know is that down here in the southwest corner of Tasmania, the solar resource is typical of a country in the northern latitudes of the northern hemisphere. So you can see that over here in the west, in the Pilbara region, for example, that there is double the solar resource that most of the developed nations have. And that places Australia in an extremely good position. Similar to what Gero showed, this little blue dot indicates that if we covered this with a solar farm, we could power all of Australia, and the green dot shows powering the rest of the world. So what does this mean in terms of our role as a future energy powerhouse? So here's our current role. We export thermal coal, which produces 400 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent when it's burnt in our trading partners overseas. We export liquefied natural gas, which produces 210 megatons of CO2 a year when burnt overseas. We ship iron ore, which is converted into steel. That produces 1,100 megatons of CO2. And we export aluminium ores, which produces a further 280 million tonnes of CO2. So these numbers are calculated from our existing exports. Most of these emissions occur in the Asia Pacific region, and they in fact account for 8% of the total emissions in the Asia Pacific. So this is a huge contribution. Contrast this with a future opportunity for Australia, where we export the same amount of energy in petajoules, let's say, but now split between 20% in electricity through undersea cable export of renewable electricity, such as the Sun Cable picture that Gero showed. And then the other 80% is exported by converting water through electrolysis into hydrogen using renewable electricity. And this would produce 50 million tonnes a year of hydrogen for export as an energy vector. So this is essentially exporting the same amount of energy as we export now, but based on renewables. If we look at the export of our ores, and instead of doing the conversion to steel overseas, we do it in Australia, we can make 500 million tonnes plus of green steel a year using renewable electricity and hydrogen, and 18 million tonnes of green aluminium a year using renewable electricity. If we add up all the renewable electricity that we will need in order to achieve that, it comes to around about 6,000 terawatt hours of electricity per year, which is around 23 times the current electricity generation in Australia. So this just shows what an enormous opportunity this is, the scale of this opportunity, if we are simply to retain the same role as an electricity exporting powerhouse in the world as we do now, and indeed maintain the same role as a producer of the requirements for iron and steel and for aluminium. And this, by the way, shows the land area that would be required if we were to have 50% solar and 50% wind generating this renewable electricity. So even if only 10% of this is true, and we go from being a major energy export powerhouse to 10% of that, and the same true with iron, steel and aluminium, then this is still a massive, massive change, and it will still require several times the current generating capacity in electricity, but in renewables into the future. So what is the future going to look like? In one way, you can consider that it's going to look much more like the Internet of Energy. There will be millions of generators, there will be millions of storage centres and millions of demand response opportunities. All households will have solar cell capability, battery storage capability and demand response capability in order to contribute to the energy generation and the energy storage and demand response side of things. The scales will be from kilowatts at household level to gigawatts at utility level, from kilowatt hours to terawatt hours. And there will be much greater interconnectivity between the nodes of demand and supply as we tap into new renewable energy locations out in the regions and new energy storage opportunities through off-river pumped hydro and batteries. So all of this will require more transmission to be built in order to make this work. And indeed, this may result in greater robustness. There is going to be more in the way of redundancy. There's a multiplicity of the key nodes. There's a greater multiplicity of transmission pathways. And we'll no longer be vulnerable to the removal of a major thermal power station from the system. Instead, this will be replaced by lots of distributed energy sources. And this has the potential, like the internet, of creating greater robustness in the system as a whole. Now, of course, countering that, we will have greater vulnerability from cyber attack. There will be more cyber attack entry points. In fact, from a data perspective, your fridge in your home could bring down the entire national electricity network if it were the weakest link in the chain from your fridge to your household demand control center to the utility, which is calling on you to undertake demand response. So this is a threat, but you could argue that this was going to happen anyway. And indeed, it might be less of a threat than taking down an entire major thermal power station. So just to summarize, the worldwide trends in energy will see a rapid decarbonisation of the energy sector on a scale not seen since the Industrial Revolution. And this will be mainly through the adoption of solar and wind with existing hydro, because very few hydro opportunities remain in most countries, and through nuclear power in those countries, unlike Australia, which allow nuclear power. And I might say a word about nuclear fusion, which is a prospect for the future, but this will occur far too late to do anything about climate change, but happy to talk about that later. There will be an increasing availability of domestic energy sources, solar, wind, unconventional gas, unconventional oil, and this will result in greater energy security as the need to import energy for many countries is significantly reduced. There will, of course, be increased vulnerability to cyber threats, as I mentioned before, but this can be ameliorated by the resilience and the robustness of the Internet of Energy, which will resemble a disseminated generation, storage and demand response system much more akin to the Internet. So that's, if you like, the take-home message from this presentation, and very happy to go to questions. Thank you.
Hi, Ken, thank you for that. I have to admit, I thought that was really eye-opening, that comparison you made to, first of all, the Industrial Revolution and the magnitude of the change that that brought about. I think that really helps to bring it home. But also, you know, that comparison to this being the Internet of Things, but for the energy size, again, that I think gives us a better insight into which way it is going. Now, Gero, I'll get you to turn your camera on as well, and we'll get to the Q&A session. We've actually got quite a lot of questions that have come through. So I'm going to try and ask us to keep the questions a little bit on the short side so that we get a chance to address as many of them as we can. But before we start that, again, thank you to both of our speakers for fantastic and fantastic presentations that really covered a lot of information. As you'd expect, there's quite a few questions. The first one, I think, is for Gero because it came in first. And it mentions, is the growth of 300 plus projects because the price per megawatt is getting cheaper, or more money, or government incentives, or something else?
Yeah, I think domestically, there's certainly no government incentives for solar and wind to come in. So it's absolutely the price and the reduction in the cost of the technology that is driving that. But I think, you know, certainly globally, I think that's still similar. There's very little incentives that happen now on the solar and wind. There's some, but there's very little on that. It's actually being driven, again, partly by the cost and the fact that it's competitive, but it's been driven by this sentiment and move to decarbonize. So your corporates or your governments really setting those targets, but the corporations themselves. So actually your Facebooks, your Amazons, and your Googles, all the big tech, they're actually the biggest movers when it comes to procuring this renewable energy, and therefore they're creating the demand, which is driving the supply. So they're doing a really, really good thing, and they're really cutting edge. And not only are they helping to drive the investment, but they're also some of the biggest companies when it comes to driving this technology forward. There are incentives that's still required on certain technologies like offshore wind, still heavily driven by incentives. And that's why we don't see any of it here in Australia just yet. And also storage. Storage still requires a little bit of incentives to get through. And then I think finally, the subject we talked about was hydrogen, of course, very early in its development. It needs a lot of work to get it commercial, and that's heavily dependent on incentives at this stage.
I just add to that, Gero, I think you've made a good point that actually incentives really aren't needed for a lot of these mature technologies. But let me make a very clear point and a clear statement here. That doesn't mean that policy doesn't have a role to play. There are two things that drive transformations of economies. One is technology and the other is policy. You can't get away without both. And let me give you one example for how policy indirectly plays a role in this massive rollout that we're seeing in solar and wind. So government policy uncertainty creates risk. Risk increases the cost of finance. Therefore, if you are operating in a chaotic government policy environment, as we have in Australia for the last decade or more, you are increasing the cost of finance, not just for solar and wind, but for everything. So having a government policy certainty is incredibly important. That does not mean throwing lots of money at incentives. What it means is signposting the pathway to zero emissions by mid-century, having trajectories, having targets, having dates, having goals for reaching 100%, 80%, 50% renewables, having goals for electrifying all sectors of the economy, having goals for the uptake of electric vehicles. If you have that government policy certainty, you will drive down the cost of finance, you will increase the viability by de-risking projects that are at risk, and you will see much, much faster investment in renewables during the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, some very good points. Another question for Gero, it's a different tack, but it's talking to the renewable energy infrastructure. And when they reach the end of their lifespans, how recyclable are they? So we're talking about solar panels, wind turbines, etc. Can they be recycled?
Look, it's a very good question, and actually one that's not really touched on, not nearly enough. And the simple answer to that is that they haven't been traditionally that recyclable, and but it's certainly an element where there's pressure on the companies to develop the technologies to be more sustainable. So the recycling is a key part of it, to use better materials. So this is something they're certainly working on in addition to driving down the cost. But the reality is on that, like I said, that because a lot of these projects are literally being built and it's still 20 or 30 years of lifetime away, it's not something that's being discussed enough. And the actual cost of decommissioning these projects can be quite significant. It's unlikely that you're going to see a solar farm kind of just removed and then rehabilitated back to its former use of the field, but more likely you'll see it repowered and then continued. So, so I think especially where the costs of panels are coming, that's more likely what's going to happen. But of course, those panels need to be recycled.
Yeah. I've just noticed another question for Ken that I think relates to what you were just speaking about. And it says, why are government policies so stalled when there's so much data available and presented in such an understandable way?
May well you ask.
Yes.
The obvious answer to that is vested interest and dinosaur politics. So not facing up to the reality of change is what killed the dinosaurs in the end, right? So the same will happen here. So dinosaur politics will eventually die. So we don't have to worry about it. But it is getting in the way of policy certainty, and so we really need to make sure that that we get alignment of climate and energy policy, that we get bipartisan agreement to do this. We're seeing bipartisan agreement between the states. Why can't we have it federally? Good question.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see some evolution happening soon. All right, Gero, how do you see the battle between green, blue hydrogen developing in Australia or globally?
Okay, that's a very, very good question. And the reality of the matter is that right now, I think the most, I mean, pretty much all hydrogen that's produced for the market, the hydrogen market right now is the kind of grey hydrogen. So it's where the carbon isn't being captured. If you capture the carbon, that incurs an additional cost, and that's where your blue comes from. I think right now maybe blue is a little bit further ahead in terms of the commercialization than green, but it's the rate at which the costs are declining for green that gets everyone excited. It's the scalability that you see, the cost declines that you've seen in solar panels over the years. If that's what happen with electrolyzers and continue to happen in renewables, and that real low cost power, those three pillars that we talked about. So even though green isn't there today, every confidence it will get there. The question is when, and when it does, it'll just continue to evolve and to continue to improve in terms of its efficiency and the commercials. And blue just will struggle. Blue will struggle because you won't be able to get that kind of scalability and that cost reduction that we'll see that we're seeing on the renewable side.
I agree with what Gero is saying, absolutely. And really what you've got to look at it from is the perspective of the customer. Okay, so the customers will drive demand for hydrogen made from renewable energy in the same way that they'll drive demand for hydrogen made from fossil fuels. And, you know, we're seeing now alignment of customers who want hydrogen made from renewable energy, and they want to be able to source it from countries that can guarantee that. So in that context, certification of the carbon content of your hydrogen is going to be incredibly important. And Australia is in a great position, not only to help design a certification scheme for hydrogen trading, and we do research in exactly that area, and we work with government, but we're going to be able to export hydrogen that the world wants, that is indeed renewable and green. And we just have to look at what's happening in Europe with the carbon border adjustment measures that are being put in place. If you export hydrogen that has significant embedded carbon dioxide content, if you like, in the sense that it's had carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere in its generation, you are not going to be able to compete with countries that are exporting renewable hydrogen once the cost curve has driven down the generation costs so that they're comparable. So over time, this is going to play out in a natural way. But I would suggest that that doesn't mean that we don't allow hydrogen created from fossil fuels at the beginning, because this might actually help accelerate the building of infrastructure so that when renewable hydrogen is ready and is made in significant quantities, it just gets on board and can be exported and sold immediately.
I think it's a very good point, Cam. And it's important that blue is still good and clean hydrogen and still an important part of the energy mix in the near term. So it's a very good point.
Awesome. Now, there was a question as well that came in. This is directed, I think, in relation to Gero's presentation. And they were asking for clarification of what you meant by seaborne.
Yes, so seaborne simply is that, that they're going to export the hydrogen to other markets. For example, like Japan, Korea, that they've made it clear they want to be able to import this. They don't have maybe the resources to develop it to the scale themselves. So the hydrogen will be exported in on ships, like we do with gas. We convert it to LNG and export it on ships and transport it via the sea. So apologies if that wasn't clear.
Yep. And I think there's a related question here, which is, given the time taken to build them, are there ammonia-ready container ships already being built, or have those design decisions been postponed until green hydrogen matures?
Look, it's a good question. It's a very technical one. I'm not an expert on hydrogen transportation. I'm happy to, if Ken has something to add on that one, but certainly not an area that I focus on.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that ammonia is really a prospective energy vector is that, well, first of all, you can take green hydrogen made from renewable energy, combine it with nitrogen from the atmosphere and produce ammonia, okay? And you can do so with renewable electricity in that transformation process from the nitrogen in the atmosphere. So you can make effectively green ammonia, no carbon dioxide released from the production process. And there is already an ammonia market in the world. It's huge. Ships are made to transport ammonia everywhere. All you need to do is grow exactly that technology, and you've got an instant opportunity then to export energy in a vector form that can, at the other end, can be used to co-fire power stations, as is already happening in Japan. You can put ammonia directly into a coal-fired power station and reduce the emissions. You can use it as the future fuel for shipping, which is how the International Maritime Organization is viewing things, that eventually, you know, these massive diesel-powered ships will replace heavy fuel oil with ammonia. So ammonia has great prospects, and unlike hydrogen, which is actually quite difficult to transport in a liquid form at very low temperatures, ammonia is readily transportable, and there's already infrastructure around the world for that.
I think recently, Ken, I think India stated that it needs, all its ammonia demand needs to be supplied by green hydrogen and no other hydrogen in future. So I think that's a good example of where you mentioned policy is important in driving this investment where it needs to be.
Yeah. Now, switching to another form of renewable energy, there's a question on where are we at on superconducting electric lines to get power to Asia and over great distances without losses?
Maybe I could answer that by saying that superconducting cables for transmission are incredibly expensive. They have a huge overhead and energy costs. And unless we get room temperature superconductors very soon, it's just going to get left in the too hard basket of history. At the moment, high voltage direct current as opposed to alternating current transmission cables at scale have loss rates of order 3% per 1,000 kilometres. So for example, the transmission line from the Northern Territory to Singapore proposed by Sun Cable will lose maybe 10 or 11% of the electricity through dissipation along that 3,800 kilometre cable. You can take that hit and still presumably make money at the other end, otherwise they wouldn't be looking at doing this. So this is all doable. There is a 3,000 kilometre high voltage transmission line, 1 million volts, that operates in China, which has exactly the same economic feasibility. So all this is doable without superconductors.
Yeah, cool. Oh, still trying to get through. We got a lot of questions coming in. So question again for Gero. Do you see the cost reduction and efficiency improvements in battery technology hindering hydrogen investment and technological improvements? Don't they both have overlapping applications with regards to energy storage?
Look, I'll keep it short because I think you've got a few questions to go through, and I'm sure there's a few towards the end there for Ken. But the simple answer is no. They don't hinder. They're both needed. They both have very different applications and uses. And certainly batteries are very much beyond just the storage of energy in terms of firming these grids as well. So very different applications. And I think, as I mentioned in that kind of cheat sheet on hydrogen, so both will emerge and both have very, very strong futures ahead.
Yeah, I think the way to think about that is in timescales. Batteries are extremely good at delivering energy on very, very short timescales, which also means they're very good for keeping the frequency stability of the network. Hydrogen is good for storage for long timescales, seasonal timescales. So for example, in northern latitudes where you have a winter demand peak, you're going to need energy at a time when there's not much solar and maybe not enough wind, and the hydro is kind of locked up in snow and ice. So you'll need hydrogen in some of those countries for the winter demand peak, and you can do that on a seasonal storage basis that cannot be done by batteries and cannot be done by hydro.
Yeah. Speaking of demand, there was a question here. I'm just flipping through to see it, but so is Ken, in regards to customer demand is driving a lot of change. Is customer demand a quantifiable thing, and how do companies get that feedback from their customer base?
So if we're talking about exports, then customer demand absolutely is driving a lot of change. And that's why we've got Japan, Germany, Korea coming to Australia and saying, we want your hydrogen, and in some cases, we want your renewable hydrogen. So clearly this is demand driven by customers, and the same I think will be true for green electricity. And then the question is, well, what about embedded energy and other products? What about green steel? Other countries, who are already heavily invested in steel production, willing to give that up and have the steel production happen in Australia? The answer may be no, but they might want to co-invest in massive steel plants, which are built right on top of our mineral resources, powered by the best renewable energy resource in the world up in the northwest of Australia. They might invest in that. They might invest just in the iron production part of it, ship the iron off to their own steel production facilities and turn the iron into steel, all sorts of combinations. So in terms of exports, demand absolutely drives the future opportunities that Australia has to retain its role as a major energy powerhouse.
Yep. Another one for you, Ken. Do you think that the prior investments in incumbent power sources is slowing the transformation? Are the current forecasts inclusive of all the existing plants running to end of life?
Very good question. So If we look at the marginal cost of generating electricity in an existing, for example, coal-fired power station, where all the investment in the plant has already been paid off, then this comes in at around $40 per megawatt hour, roughly. And if we look at the cost of building an entirely new coal-fired power station to replace that, that comes in at about $75 a megawatt hour. The competition then is with solar and wind. And at the moment, wind is coming in of order $40 to $50 a megawatt hour. And that is being driven down constantly. And as the figures in Gero's presentation showed, the same is true of solar. So we're reaching a point where the marginal cost of coal-fired power generation is being competed out by the total cost of solar and wind generation, which means that companies which are looking at big maintenance costs to fix up their coal-fired power stations, which are getting old and falling apart, won't bother doing that because they can't justify the investment in that rebuild of the plant. They'd much rather build a new solar farm or a new wind farm that's going to last them 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. So a related question then is, do you think Australia's export of carbon-based energy has peaked? And if not, when do you think it will happen?
Very good question. So again, this is dependent on world demand, and you know, remember that Australia is not turning on a tap or on and off like OPEC when it comes to sending out LNG or coal, right? This is purely demand driven. And so the rest of the world's demand for fossil fuels will determine where the peak in our exports lie. And let me make one point here. Australia, you know, often people say Australia is exporting coal and causing greenhouse gas emissions, global warming, etc. That's true that we're exporting the coal, but it's the demand from other countries that is creating the emissions, right? It's emissions offshore. And if those countries decided not to source Australian coal, which by and large produces less greenhouse gas emissions per megawatt hour of electricity than coal from other countries, then what we would be doing would be condemning the world to even more global warming if those overseas demand sources used dirtier, more emitting coal from other countries. So we have to remember what the big picture is here. This is demand driven. And if we can satisfy the world's demand during this transition phase that we have to have and produce less greenhouse gas emissions by doing so, then we are doing the right thing.
I think there's a few more LNG projects that are in the pipeline and potentially a few debottlenecks and brownfield expansions. So I think certainly the LNG exports are going to increase in the short term. And of course, gas being an important part of this transition story also.
Now, there's a question here, which is a slightly different topic, about recent exploration of the potential for wave-generated power, particularly in the sea northeast of Tasmania. And it's not directed, it says, do you want to comment on this, please? Any thoughts on wave generation?
Look, wave, there's lots of other renewables beyond solar and wind, but I think I showed in terms of that outlook of where the technologies are coming from, just solar and wind dominate. Nothing compares to solar when it comes to the cost reductions that we're seeing year on year. So unfortunately, these technologies, every year that we go on, it's harder for them to establish themselves when the costs of solar and wind are coming down so much. That said, it doesn't mean they're not going to happen. There'll always be areas where that technology may be right for a particular location.
Yeah.
So maybe there's just not a good solar resource, for example.
And speaking of which technology is right, there's a question, are countries still investing in nuclear, or is that investment now going to renewables?
Well, I think certainly the IEA are very bullish on nuclear and the outlook. I don't think Rystad we are as bullish on that, but so there certainly is investment. Ken, is that something that you wanted to go into?
I think that's right. And the investment is shifting from countries that actually have nuclear already to countries that don't. You know, you look at what's happening in the Middle East, for example, with contracts being let there for nuclear power stations. So yes, I think absolutely nuclear has a role to play in some countries that have legislated against it for all sorts of political reasons. That won't happen. but I think we'll see an increase in nuclear gradually over time. But remember, nuclear is very expensive. By comparison to solar wind, I mean, when you're talking about new build power stations, absolutely you'd build solar and wind unless you had another reason to do so. But for those countries which don't have a great lot of solar resource or don't have a great deal of wind resource, then nuclear may well be part of the mix.
All right, I'm going to combine a couple of questions for you, Ken. First one is, who will pay for the calculated 52 trillion it will take to get the world to net zero? Will it just be governments? Where do you see economic opportunity for corporate investment? But I think a question that's related that you might be able to tie in is, how does the Australian government funding for these initiatives compare with the rest of the world?
Yeah, so, this is all part of economic business. If we had to renew a coal-fired power station, you'd spend, a few $1 billion on doing that anyway. But instead of building a coal-fired power station, now we're going to build wind farms and solar farms. It's all part of the economic process. It's not as though we've got to spend extra money to do stuff. All we're doing is retiring old stuff and doing what we would have to do anyway, which is to build new stuff. So don't regard this as an additional cost. And indeed, this actually could be cheaper than just continuing the way we are, because the economics are showing us that that new build solar and wind is actually going to be cheaper for us in the future. So, companies will make the investment, electricity retailers will sell the electricity, consumers will buy the electricity. This is how the economics of this all works. It's not as though suddenly we've got this huge impost and we have to tax the world. No, it's business as usual. And on the Australian side of things, so the same's true here. I mean, companies are making these investments based on, serious, sensible business decisions. If we look at the domestic side of things, this is happening, continuously. Renewable energy zones are building out in the regions. Companies are making these investments. There is a role for government to make sure that there is the transmission in place to be able to connect those renewable energy zones to the demand centres. And there is a role for government in encouraging and incentivising storage, for example, batteries, ultra-river pumped hydro, all these things. But there is not a role for government to make massive investments in the generation side of things. That will happen naturally through the corporate sector.
Awesome. Now, I realize we've run a little bit over time. If you're okay to stay for another minute or two, I might just get to one or two more questions. So this one's for Gero. You mentioned Tasmania being positioned well due to the predictability of tidal power, but the questioner's understanding was that one of the main benefits of green hydrogen production is that excess cheap power in the grid can be used in electrolysis. So how significant is the need to keep hydrogen production going? Can you envisage green hydrogen production plants dipping into the energy grid and using non-green electricity sources at times when there are dips from renewable sources?
Okay, so it's a very good question again, and thank you very much for this and all the questions today. They've been fantastic as a presenter to get this level of question. But just to be clear on that, I think Tasmania was about the hydro, not the tidal energy. I think, but I get the point of the question, and it's the hydrogen generation production is not going to be just through excess electricity. There's going to be dedicated resources for it. It's going to be huge. Like I mentioned, the utilization is going to have to be quite high to get the economics to work. So it can't be just when there's enough generation of renewables. But a simple answer to that question is no, it's not going to dip into a coal-fired power station to power it instead of the hydro, because it can't. Otherwise, it wouldn't be green. It has to be generated by renewable energy.
Yeah, and I think that if you look at the development of hydrogen projects that are planned into the future, the vast majority of these will be standalone. I mean, if you look at the Asian Renewable Energy Hub that's proposed for the Pilbara region, that's a 15 gigawatt solar and wind power station that will produce hydrogen that will then make ammonia. There's another one proposed by the same developers for the Nullarbor region that'll be 50 gigawatts, and that'll be standalone. So these export opportunities for generating hydrogen will largely, I think, happen off-grid. And there might be some on-grid production, as you say, to soak up a bit of excess renewables. You might have PPAs with power purchase agreements with renewable energy companies to drive hydrogen production domestically, but it'll be the export tail wagging the domestic dog. It'll just be dominant, and we shouldn't even be thinking about having starting off with a bit of a domestic market and putting hydrogen into the gas network and building demand, this sort of stuff. I mean, that's sort of old ways of thinking. We should think about exports from the beginning. That's where the real demand opportunities lie. And to think that that's going to be driven by domestic demand for hydrogen is pie in the sky. It's going to be driven by export.
I think there are some incentives. Again, ARENA is looking to incentivize, and the state governments are looking to incentivize this development of hydrogen, both for export and domestic reasons. But also other countries are racing to this, and that's why we come to this kind of hydrogen wars, because they are really racing to get this technology developed. So can we do more? Absolutely, we can do more for that.
All right, and last question, I think, because we really have run over time. While oil and coal are expected to disappear in the energy source charts, gas seems to continue pretty much at the same level all the way to 2050. So do you see that as being true, and why?
Look, I'll do a quick answer to that and then I'll hand over to Ken. It looks like gas is a quick way of helping get coal out of the system. It's a good thing, but less emissions there, but still it does emit. So one thing we haven't mentioned today, it's certainly not my area, but carbon capture is a very important part of this decarbonisation, and that technology is moving very fast. And some companies, in particular companies we have here, Santos is a good example, that are really pushing to accelerate carbon capture. So that'll be an important part of the mix, and no doubt will help keep gas in the energy mix for some time yet.
Yeah, I think that gas, is seen as a transition fuel in many countries that have got still major investments in coal. And as Gero says, you swap out coal for gas and then gas for renewables down the track. Actually, that's not happening in Australia. Gas is not a transition fuel in Australia. It's so much cheaper to install solar and wind at utility scale than it is to install gas, that gas is not going to be used in the intervening period at all. It'll be used as a peaking fuel. And that's a very important role for gas in Australia, is to provide the energy at times when solar and wind aren't operating and when coal-fired power is being phased out, in order to make demand match supply, so that we now have a way of balancing the system. But eventually that'll be phased out as well, once batteries and off-river pumped hydro and other forms of storage fill that role.
And I think the government could promote hydrogen there as a peaking fuel, couldn't it? Instead of, it didn't have to use gas. It will. I think it's pushing for gas, but it could push hydrogen. I think that'll, as we get closer to those coming in, there'll be more and more hydrogen in those mix, in those peaking plants. But yeah, lots of exciting developments to come.
All right, awesome. I think because we have now reached 1:10, even though there are a few more questions, I think we could be here for quite some time. So instead, I'm going to wrap it up. A reminder to all of our attendees that we'll make this recording available, and we'll potentially be able to send out answers to some of the questions that we didn't get to along with that email. But I want to thank our audience for joining and for staying with us, even though we've run over time. But I thought it was important to get to a lot of those questions that had been asked. But special thanks both to Gero and for Ken for making the time, for sharing your expertise with us. It's a rare opportunity to be able to have such a great conversation with people that are so intimate with the data in this area, and it's such an important goal for the world, and such an interesting and changing time. So I thank you both wholeheartedly for joining us today. So with that,
pleasure.
Pleasure, absolutely.
All right, with that, I'll say goodbye, and once again, thank you to everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.